Welcome, everyone, to this year's Shaffer Lecture. On February 6th, 1930, Yale University issued a press release, so they knew how to do that even then. And it said, John C. Shaffer, publisher of the Chicago Evening Post, has established a foundation, we would now call it an endowment, in the Yale Divinity School in memory of his son, Kent, a graduate of Yale University, who died in 1925. The income of the foundation is to be used for a course of lectures upon the life, character, and teachings of Jesus. The Shaffer Lectures occur every other year, alternating with the Nathaniel Taylor Lectures, which are on some aspect of theology. Past Shaffer lecturers include Bart Ehrman, Susan Garrett, Lou Martin, Abe Mallerby, N.T. Wright, Martin Hengel, and E.P. Sanders. This year's lecturer is John P. Meier. Father Meier was educated at St. Joseph's Seminary and College in New York, at the Gregorian University in Rome, and at the Pontifical Biblical Institute, also in Rome. His scholarly interests are in the area of New Testament, specifically in the historical Jesus and the Gospel of Matthew, as well as Palestinian Judaism in the 1st century CE. Having published the first 3 volumes of his magisterial work on the historical Jesus, entitled A Marginal Jew, in 1991, 94, and 2001, he's now working on the 4th volume in that series. And I understand there may even be a 5th. He's also written 6 other books, as well as over 65 articles for journals and collected essays. At various times, he's been the editor of or associate editor of the Catholic Biblical Quarterly and New Testament Studies. In the spring of 2002, Father Meier was appointed to the William K. Warren Foundation Chair of Theology at the University of Notre Dame. The topic of his Shaffer Lectures this year will be on the danger of making Jesus a Christian, the test case of law and morality. And today's subject will be the Jewish Jesus on divorce. The other lectures in this series will take place at 10:30 tomorrow and Thursday, and will treat the Jewish Jesus and the Sabbath and the Jewish Jesus and purity laws. Please join me in welcoming John Meier to the Shaffer Lectures.
Thank you. Thank you, and thank you, Harry, very much for that gracious introduction. Indeed, I had not planned on a 5th volume of A Marginal Jew, but if a Pentateuch was good enough for Moses, it's good enough for me. Give me that old-time 5-scroll approach. Actually, after I published volume 3 of my series A Marginal Jew in 2001, I proceeded to what I thought would be a fairly quick and easy survey of Jesus, the Mosaic Law, and morality. It would be quick and easy, I thought, because after all, aren't there so many books and essays already out there on Jesus and the law? You could drown in them. I would simply cherry pick the best of them, put my own Bill O'Reilly spin on it, and be done with the topic. Alas, as I slouch slowly toward the completion of my treatment of Jesus and the law in the academic year 2006 and 7, I have come to the sad conclusion that every book ever written on Jesus and the law is hopelessly wrong. Now, I'm not yet sure what's right, but I know everything else is wrong. Why wrong? Among other reasons, because authors usually fail to make some vital distinctions about the historical Jesus and his teaching on Torah. All other mistakes proceed from these primordial mistakes. Hence, what I would like to do in these 3 Shaffer lectures is first explore with you these pivotal distinctions and then apply them to three major test cases, three key areas of Jesus' teaching on Torah, law, divorce, Sabbath, and purity rules. Today, we'll look at Jesus and Jewish divorce. But as a prelude, let us first draw those vital distinctions that hopefully will keep us from simply repeating the mistakes of the past, a fond hope we always have that we do not always achieve. If you look, therefore, for instance, on your outline, first of all, the introduction, three important preliminary distinctions. The first important distinction to grasp is the difference between Christology and the quest for the historical Jesus. Both are valid academic endeavors, as are the theology and history departments of a university that house both areas of study. Obviously, the two endeavors are related, but I always begin a course on either Christology or the historical Jesus by insisting on a clear distinction between the two fields. Christology is a subdivision of the academic discipline called theology, in Anselm's famous phrase, fides quaerens intellectum, faith-seeking understanding. Christology as a subdivision is therefore faith-seeking understanding of Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior, the very object of Christian faith. By definition, then, Christology operates within the sphere of Christian faith, however much it may probe aspects of this faith or question traditional understandings of the faith. By contrast, the quest for the historical Jesus is by definition a strictly empirical, historical endeavor. If historical Jesus means anything, it means that. A historical endeavor open to any competent historian of any faith or no faith whatever. Of its nature, then, it prescinds from or brackets Christian faith. This does not mean that it denies, rejects, or attacks such faith. The quest simply prescinds from Christian faith the way a world-class astronomer, who happens to be a devout Christian, would prescind from a theology of God the Creator or the Trinity when she is exploring the outer reaches of a galaxy. She may be unable to explain these three co-equal brilliant sources of light at the far end of the universe, but she may not invoke the Trinity as a literal deus ex machina. All this is simply a matter of functional specialization, a term beloved of Bernard Lonergan. To be sure, there is always the possibility of a critical correlation among various disciplines after each has done its own work according to its own proper method, but not before. To attempt such a cross-fertilization prematurely would be to short-circuit the whole process and violate the integrity and autonomy of each discipline. Now, granted this distinction between Christology and the quest for the historical Jesus, what do I mean then by the historical Jesus? The historical Jesus is that Jesus whom we can recover or reconstruct by using the scientific tools of modern historical research as applied to ancient sources. Of its nature, the historical Jesus is a modern abstraction and construct. He is not coterminous with the full reality of Jesus of Nazareth, which would include everything Jesus ever said or did during some 30-something years of his life. That's the full reality of Jesus. Totally unachievable by us today. It really happened. Because we don't know it, doesn't mean it really didn't happen, but it just reminds us historical Jesus, real Jesus, not the same thing. In other words, the historical Jesus is not to be equated with the real Jesus, no more than the historical Caligula is to be equated with the real Caligula, if I may use a younger contemporary of Jesus with a somewhat different temperament. Although, was he all that much? Sad, bad, or mad? What the real Caligula was is by no means what Suetonius and Tacitus in their terribly biased presentations represent. Remember, the history is written by the people who assassinated Caligula. What would have been Pilate's form of a gospel if we had a real gospel of Pilate? So much then for the first distinction. Second distinction. This first distinction between the quest for the historical Jesus and Christology naturally leads to, indeed, really embraces within itself a second important distinction, namely the distinction between our empirical historical knowledge of a certain Palestinian Jew of the first century named Yeshua of Nazareth, and our faith knowledge of Jesus Christ, whom Christians proclaim to be their crucified Lord and Savior. To be sure, believing Christians insist that these two figures are one and the same person, considered at different stages of his existence or considered from different vantage points. And as a Christian, I certainly affirm that identity in faith. But academic historians, be they Catholic, Protestant, Jew, whatever, necessarily prescind from faith for the sake of the method in the historical quest. Such historians must insist that the precise object of their investigation, the historical Jesus, is always, solely, and entirely a first-century Jew with no Christian pontifical vestments hiding under his Jewish cloak. All a historian, precisely as a historian, qua historian, can know is a particular circumcised Jewish male from Galilee who in the first decades of the first century CE regularly went up to Jerusalem to observe the main and even some minor Jewish feast in the temple. Think of Hanukkah in John 10. Despite the United States today, Hanukkah was a nothing recent feast. Jesus even goes to that. What kind of Jew he was, where he fit on the variegated map of first century Judaism, how much he may have diverged from what can be very vaguely called mainstream Judaism of the time, are all valid questions for debate. But if there is any enduring gain from the so-called third quest for the historical Jesus, it is the one hammered home by scholars like Geza Vermesch and E.P. Sanders, Jesus first, last, and only a Jew. This distinction leads in turn to a third, more specific distinction, which brings me to the subject of today's lecture. I refer to the distinction between Christian theology or ethics on the one hand and the teaching of the Jewish Jesus about the Jewish law on the other. Perhaps in no other area of the quest is the tendency to ignore the obvious fact that the Jewish Jesus is addressing his fellow Jews so subtle yet all pervasive. Be it the question of divorce or the Sabbath, purity rules, or the prohibition of taking of an oath, the unspoken thrust of most articles and books on Jesus and the law is to place Jesus' teaching on law and ethics primarily in the context of Christian theology rather than in the context of first-century Jewish debates about legal observance. Here, the peril of ignoring the Jewishness of Jesus mutates into the peril of guaranteeing that the teaching of this Jew will always be immediately and directly relevant to Christians with no hermeneutical reflection, with no sense of distance and difference necessary. Many modern Christians unconsciously desire a Thomas Jefferson Enlightenment Jesus or a Buddha-like New Age Jesus who is either a great moral philosopher inculcating eternal truths or a psychobabble counselor suggesting warm, fuzzy maybes. In contrast, as I can well attest from past lectures, Christian eyes glaze over instantly as soon as a scholar insists on envisioning Jesus as a Jew immersed in the legal halakhic debates of his fellow first-century Jews. Who cares is the secret unspoken feeling. Therefore, in my opinion, the best way of preventing any erasing of Jesus' Jewishness is to insist on understanding this first-century Jew as addressing his fellow Palestinian Jews within the confines of Jewish legal debates without the slightest concern about whether any of this is of interest to Christians. In other words, to understand the ethical teaching of the historical Jesus, you must place him firmly and solely within the context of the Jewish law. The historical Jesus is the halakhic Jesus, the Jesus seminar notwithstanding. I must stress this point from the start, because just as most quests for the historical Jesus have been Christology in historical disguise, so too most treatments of Jesus and the law are simply works on Christian morality or ethics wearing a yarmulke. Indeed, it could be argued that the obliteration of Jesus' Jewishness reaches its high point in the question of Jesus and the law, where the Jewish Jesus regularly morphs into the Christian Paul, Augustine, Luther, or Barth, not to mention those anonymous Christian theologians of the law whom we call Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Hence, I must emphasize that the question I am asking today is what one first-century Palestinian Jew, somewhere around 28 to 30 CE, taught other first-century Palestinian Jews about Jewish divorce. In other words, we are not asking primarily about what first or second generation Christians made of Jesus' teaching. To be sure, the latter focus is a constant temptation. First, because Christian documents provide us with our only access to the historical Jesus' teaching on divorce. And second, because questions of Christian pastoral practice today usually drive the scholarly inquiry, no matter how much we talk about the historical Jesus. Hence, I must prove myself a cold, hard-hearted academic by banishing all Christian concerns from this lecture. Let all catechumens depart. Close the doors. Most books and articles on the question are consciously or unconsciously structured so as to attain in the end the holy grail, not of the Da Vinci Code, but of the proper solution to the present-day problem of frequent divorce among Christians. Now, I certainly understand and sympathize with that aim within the larger project of Christian moral theology and church law, yes. But when it comes to the quest for the historical Jesus and divorce, we face a glaring example of an unpalatable truth. Relevance is the enemy of history, by which I mean, of course, a facile rush to relevance is the enemy of sober history. Needless to say, I would not object to Christian theologians and canonists using the results of a sober quest for the historical Jesus in their own reflections. But first, the quest for a Jew teaching Jewish law to other Jews must be pursued on its own terms for its own sake. To do otherwise is to fall into the original sin of confusing historical quest with Christology, the original sin of turning Jesus into a Christian, the original sin of Christianizing Jesus. Any serious historical investigation challenges us to face the past as past, that is, as strange, different, even off-putting, with no guarantee that what we learn will prove relevant to our agendas. So it must be with a quest for the teaching of one particular first-century Jew about Jewish divorce. That said, it is high time we focused upon today's topic, Jewish divorce. Insisting on Jewish divorce naturally brings us to the context of Jesus' teaching within the practice of the ancient Near East, the Jewish scriptures, and the Jewish writers of Jesus' day. Now, it is vital to remember that what Christians call the Old Testament contains no notable body of divorce law. What is the corpus of divorce law in the Old Testament? Nothing. Divorce was simply the given throughout the ancient Near East. A traditional institution, divorce was a matter of private, not public law. It was handled within the family and the clan, and the state or larger society had no business intervening. There were no divorce courts at the time, for the most part, no certificate of divorce granted you by the nation state. With some intriguing exceptions, the power to divorce lay with the husband. This understanding of divorce is taken over by the Old Testament, which presupposes the institution rather than creating or regulating it with great detail. The few scattered divorce laws that exist in the 5 books of Moses deal mostly with the unusual cases in which the virtually unlimited power of the husband in matters of divorce was limited. It was that unusual situation which called forth a law. The only law of the Pentateuch that actually mentions the procedure for divorce, and then only in passing, is Deuteronomy 24, 1-4, which you have on your handout sheet of text there, upper right-hand corner. Without any exact parallel in the ancient Near Eastern law, Deuteronomy 24, 1-4 treats the special case of a wife who is divorced by her first husband and then by her second husband. This poor woman can't win. After the second husband divorces her or dies, she may not be married again to her first husband. That's the point of the law, the prohibition of going back to the first husband. This curious piece of legislation, unparalleled really in the rest of ancient Near Eastern corpus of law, became pivotal in later legal developments because it alone, among the laws of the Pentateuch, mentions in passing the mechanism of the certificate of divorce, Sefer Keretut, which a husband must give the wife he divorces. Likewise, in passing, the law mentions that the first husband divorces his wife because he finds in her something shameful, erwath davar. The phrase is vague and perhaps purposely so. Its very vagueness may be calculated to give almost unlimited discretion to the husband in an honor-shame society. Something shameful. Whatever the male group thinks is shameful, that's sufficient. But the certificate and the shameful thing will themselves become major objects of legislation later on. Originally, however, the sole direct object of the law in Deuteronomy 24, 1-4 was the prohibition of the return to the first husband by the twice divorced wife, not the certificate, not the grounds of divorce. It is especially after the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE that the question of divorce begins to heat up among those Israelites returning to Judea. The book of Ezra in chapters 9 and 10 seem to reflect some sort of attempt to force Jewish husbands in Jerusalem to divorce their foreign wives, though the exact problem is not entirely clear. This problem in turn may be reflected in a very obscure text in Malachi 2:10-16. Verse 16 is usually translated in our Bibles as, "I hate divorce, says the Lord." Well, whatever the real meaning of the Hebrew in the Masoretic text may be, and the text actually may be quite corrupt in its present form, the text does not mean "I hate divorce." We're not sure what it means, really. Interestingly, this puzzling text of Malachi had already become a bone of contention in the 2 centuries prior to Jesus. One strand of the Greek so-called Septuagint translation of Malachi makes the text condemn divorce when done out of hatred, while the other strand recommends divorce when hatred has arisen. Talk about having it both ways. Intriguingly, a Hebrew fragment of Malachi from Cave 4 at Qumran follows the latter tradition. And so we are left with the prophet Malachi recommending divorce at Qumran. Oy vey. Actually, it is this more permissive tradition that is witnessed for the most part in the intertestamental period and continued later on in the rabbinic literature. More to the point, it is the tradition Jesus addresses. In the 1st century CE, both the philosopher Philo and the historian Josephus state boldly that divorce may take place for any reason. And Josephus, multiply divorced, adds, and such reasons often arise in human affairs. The only stern reservations about divorce are found in the Essene literature, though the precise meaning of a key passage in the Damascus document remains debatable. In my view, the main object of the text polemic is polygyny. That is the case of one man having more than one wife. Marriage after divorce may likewise be prohibited by this text, but not divorce as such. Indeed, at least one passage in the Damascus document may indicate that divorce was allowed. In another Essene document, the Temple Scroll, one passage seems to forbid polygyny and divorce with remarriage, but the prohibition apparently applies only to the king in some ideal future. Other passages in the Temple Scroll, as they rework the laws of the Pentateuch, seem to presuppose divorce. In brief, it is an exaggeration, to say the least, to claim that Qumran forbade divorce, period. What is primarily prohibited is polygyny. Divorce with remarriage seems to be forbidden, at least to some people at some times, though divorce in itself does not seem to be prohibited outright. If we may complete this quick survey by glancing forward to the Mishnah, the first part of the Talmud, the Mishnah being composed around 200 CE. The tractate Gittin contains something truly new on the Jewish scene. Debating the meaning of the obscure phrase something shameful in Deuteronomy 24:1, the school of Shammai, so we are told, claims that the phrase indicates that a man may divorce his wife only if she is guilty of some shameful conduct. The school of Hillel, carrying on the tradition found in the Old Testament Philo and Josephus, insists that any reason whatever, however frivolous, burnt food at a meal, a more beautiful woman you found, whatever, is sufficient grounds for divorce. The truly significant point here is that the Mishnah is the first text of Palestinian Judaism to witness to a debate over what constitutes sufficient grounds for divorce. Thus, one sees immediately the problem of invoking this Shammai Hillel debate as background for the teaching of Jesus. Background which happens to be about 150 years later than the thing it's supposed to be background of, Back to the Future, the ultimate problem of using later rabbinic text as background for the historical Jesus. Now, against this briefly sketched backdrop, let us look at the relevant New Testament text. And you have those likewise, thanks to our lovely staff here at the Divinity School, on your handout pages of text. Restricting ourselves for the moment to the three key parallel texts and placing them in roughly chronological order, we will review Paul's treatment of divorce in 1 Corinthians 7:10-11, the Q tradition lying behind Matthew 5:32 and Luke 16:18, and finally Mark 10:11-12. By the way, I should note that for the purpose of this lecture, I am presupposing the priority of Mark and the existence of some sort of Q tradition available to both Matthew and Luke. To begin then with 1 Corinthians 7. Paul spends chapter 7 of 1 Corinthians dealing with the various states of life, or social statuses, of the Corinthian Christians. Through most of the chapter, Paul boldly issues all sorts of advice and directives with the serene assurance of his apostolic authority. Phrases like, I say, I wish, my opinion is, along with, of course, direct commands, pepper the chapter. Paul did not suffer from low self-esteem. He was a great apostle with a big heart and a bigger ego. All the more striking, then, is the way Paul broaches the question of divorce in verse 10 with an abrupt self-correction containing an important distinction. Now to the married, I give the command, not I, but the Lord. One gets the impression that Paul, realizing that a prohibition of divorce ran against the common sense and practice of the whole ancient world, not to mention the modern world, felt he had to appeal on this point to higher authority. Hence, as in a few other passages in 1 Corinthians, we have the very rare case of Paul appealing to a teaching of Jesus that is paralleled in the Synoptic Gospels. As in almost all such cases, the tradition of the Lord's Supper being an exception, Paul paraphrases rather than quotes Jesus' words. Therefore, the parallel of 1 Corinthians with Q and Mark will of its nature be a vague one of substance rather than a word-for-word correspondence. Still, a basic two-part division, which is also discernible in all the gospel sayings on divorce, shines through Paul's version in verses 10 to 11, especially if you understand a typical Pauline parenthesis in the middle. Quote, a wife is not to separate from her husband, parenthesis, but if she does, she is to remain unmarried or be reconciled with her husband, close parenthesis, and a husband is not to divorce his wife. You see the two-part prohibition there. If I may anticipate for a moment what we shall see in the gospel text, this laconic and absolute prohibition shows Paul's pastoral adaptation of the Jesus tradition to a Roman legal context. If, as I will argue later, the original Jesus saying envisioned divorce only by the husband, Paul, writing to Christians in the rebuilt city of Corinth, which had become a Roman colony with Roman law, expands the prohibition to cover wives, since in Roman law by the 1st century, not too much before, but by the 1st century, a fully free woman had the right to divorce her husband. Not all women. You often read in textbooks, well, in Roman law, women could divorce their husband. No, a fully free woman sui juris could. For instance, an ex-slave woman who was still under the patronus could not, without the patronus's permission, etc., etc. Always beware of the general sweeping statement. A fully free woman in Roman law could divorce her husband. But equal rights mean equal obligations and equal prohibitions for Paul. If the Christian wife does go ahead with a divorce that is legal in the eyes of Roman society, her only options, says Paul, commenting on the core prohibition, are to remain unmarried or to be reconciled with her husband. Underlying the command to remain unmarried, and hence the prohibition of entering a second marriage, seems to be the presumption that the Christian marriage bond remains. True, a divorce has taken place empirically, but it is a divorce that is recognized by civil pagan society, not by God or the Christian community. Interestingly, Paul never states what he thinks the status of a second marriage would be if it were attempted by a Christian. In other words, he does not articulate what lies at the heart of the synoptic prohibition, namely that a second marriage constitutes adultery. The underlying presuppositions of 1 Corinthians 7, 10 to 11 may point in that direction, but the conclusion is not stated. A further difference from the Gospels is that Paul then proceeds in verses 12 to 16 to permit a Christian spouse to leave a marriage with a pagan partner if the pagan refuses to live in peace with the Christian spouse. Quite understandably, Paul does not try to invoke any teaching of Jesus to solve this problem, which is proper to a Christian community. Paul explicitly states that in this case, I, not the Lord, say, we're back to our usual argument, Paul's authority is enough. Still more intriguing is Paul's perhaps embarrassed silence on whether the Christian, having divorced the pagan spouse, may remarry. Unlike some other cases in 1 Corinthians 7, Paul is not eager here to offer his opinion, however distinct from Jesus's. Don't ask, don't tell in this case, apparently. Enough then for Paul. Let us turn to the Q tradition. The synoptic prohibition of divorce takes a somewhat different form from Paul's. At the heart of the synoptic saying common to Mark, Matthew, and Luke stands the branding of divorce and remarriage as adultery, something Paul never explicitly says. In both Matthew and Luke, we find this brief saying, Matthew 5:32 and Luke 16:18, placed in a larger redactional context. Matthew, quite typically of him, encases the saying in the architectonic structure of a Sermon on the Mount, specifically in the third of his 6 antitheses, "It was said to the men of old, but I say to you." Luke, also typically of him, presents a looser structure. The prohibition stands in a small bundle of sayings, 16:14-18, in one of those mini discourses Jesus delivers during Luke's great journey narrative up to Jerusalem, which takes up chapters 9-19, about half of the gospel. And the theological topics of the great journey narrative seem to meander just as much as the geography does. In sum, both forms of the prohibition are easily detached from their larger artificial context of redaction. Still, even devout believers in the Q document must ask, are the Matthean and Lucan forms in fact taken from Q, or are they different forms of a stray saying that came to both evangelists via the oral tradition? In my view, a close comparison of the two forms in Greek make the hypothesis of a single written source more likely. In a nutshell, both Matthew and Luke present a two-part saying, each part reflecting more or less a casuistic form of law. In each part, the man is the lead agent. He alone divorces, and so he alone is ultimately responsible for the ensuing adultery. The woman is always the object of the male's action. As we shall see, this is a notable difference between the Q and the Markan forms. All in all, then, there are sufficient reasons for assigning the saying to Q. Granted, though, that both Matthew and Luke have left their redactional fingerprints on the saying, can we reconstruct a hypothetical Q form, a dicey operation? But on the other hand, an international team of scholars has produced a whole huge volume that claims to reconstruct Q word for word, which would require the omniscience of God himself, so why shouldn't we try with a single saying? We're only imitating a little bit of God's omniscience. On Matthew's side, only Matthew has the so-called acceptive clause, paraktos logo porneas, except in the case of porneia, whatever porneia may be. This acceptive clause overloads the first line of the prohibition and is present only in Matthew. Paul, Mark, and Luke all lack this proviso. Indeed, if the acceptive clause stood in the original form of the saying, how do we explain why Paul, Mark, and Luke all agree on its omission without the benefit of a conference call? Paul certainly had no problem with the idea of an exception, since he makes one for mixed marriages. Hence, however intriguing Matthew's obscure acceptive clause may be for exegetes, it should be dropped from the primitive form. We are therefore thankfully excused from having to wrestle with the intractable problem of what exactly porneia means in Matthew 5:32. Well, should we apply Occam's razor to the first part of Luke's prohibition, since the phrase, "and marrying another woman," does not occur in Matthew 5:32? Here I would be more cautious, since the equivalent clause does occur in the Markan form of the saying in Mark 10:11. Moreover, there is the question of the inner logic of the prohibition and of the metaphor used. The reprobated action of the man initiating the divorce is branded adultery. This accusation, however provocative, makes much more sense if the man not only divorces his first wife, but marries a second wife. Without the new sexual relationship, it is difficult to see why the mere act of divorce should have conjured up the precise label of adultery. The second marriage makes the rationale of the accusation perfectly clear. Hence, tentatively, I would retain the phrase, "and marrying another" for Q. The conclusion of the first half of Matthew's prohibition is likewise unique to Matthew 5:32. The divorcing husband causes his wife to be involved in adultery, or translated over literally, he causes her to be adulterated. Some exegetes claim that the highly Jewish Palestinian male perspective of this version argues for its originality. In other words, by divorcing his wife, the husband forces her to seek the only protection available, a second marriage, which all the forms of the Synoptic Prohibition brand as adultery. He forces her to be involved in an adulterous relationship. Since all power in divorce lies with the husband, he is the one responsible for the adulterous relationship that arises from his initiative. While I find this suggestion attractive, it does suffer from the fact that no other form of the prohibition, even Matthew's own version in Matthew 19:9, has this formulation. Hence again, tentatively, I would favor the wording of the conclusion of the first half that is found in all other synoptic forms, namely, he commits adultery. The special formulation in Matthew 5:32 may be an example of Matthew's adaptation of the earlier tradition to a strongly Jewish Christian church. Thankfully, the second half of the prohibition is basically the same in both Matthew and Luke. However, the specification in Luke's form that the woman was divorced by her husband may be Luke's way of emphasizing that the first marriage bond remains. That is to say, the man is still her husband despite his action. I'm all the more suspicious because the word man or male, aner in the Greek, is a favorite one of Luke's. And so I would drop the phrase by her husband from the second half of the saying as a later clarifying addition. The upshot of this all too rapid analysis is that the primitive Q form of the prohibition probably ran something like, everyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery, and the man marrying a divorced woman commits adultery. Notice always from the viewpoint of the male. We wind up with a balanced, succinct rhetorical bombshell that would certainly be worthy of the provocative wordsmith named Jesus of Nazareth. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Have we at last, or at least, attained the earliest available or most primitive form of the saying? Well, before we make that statement, let's take a look at Mark, specifically Mark 10:11-12, if you would look at that on your sheet of text. When exegetes treat the Markan form of the tradition, they often take up immediately the whole dispute story or Streitgespräch in Mark 10:2-12. I prefer not to do that, since the dispute story as a whole does not enjoy multiple attestation. Taken as a whole, it is a Markan composition that Matthew repeats with redactional changes, and Luke omits it. What does enjoy multiple attestation is the double saying at the end of the story, namely Mark 10:11-12. What we notice immediately in the Markan version of the saying is that the simple two-part formulation reflected in Q has somehow mutated into a double equal opportunity form in Mark. The statement about the man divorcing his wife is paralleled by the corresponding statement about the woman divorcing her husband. The underlying idea that is present in all the synoptic forms of the prohibition is that any combination of divorce and remarriage, no matter who is the lead agent and no matter who gets remarried, constitutes adultery. This idea may also be implied by Paul's version, though it is not stated as such. One explicit element that does unite Paul and Mark is that they are the two who balance the action of the husband divorcing his wife with the equal prospect of the wife divorcing her husband. Since Paul's paraphrase may be influenced by the Roman legal situation at Corinth, it may well be that Mark's double version may likewise reflect Roman law. This would make perfect sense if, as many hold, Mark wrote his gospel in and for the Christian community at Rome. If this be the case, then probably even in the Markan tradition, the most primitive version of the prohibition envisioned only the husband as having the power to divorce. And indeed, The second part of that saying, referring to the woman, is a slightly shortened, abbreviated form of the saying referring to the husband. This would cohere with the fact that for all the differences in Matthew and Luke, the prohibition in both is formulated exclusively from the male point of view. This, I would argue, fits well with the scenario of one Palestinian Jew named Jesus preaching to his fellow Palestinian Jews, most of them poor peasants or urban laborers. As far as we can tell, among ordinary Palestinian Jews of the early 1st century CE, only the husband had the power to divorce. To be sure, and I must stress this, circumstances were different in other times and places and in other social strata. For instance, the papyri of the Jewish military colony at Elephantine in Egypt, dating from the 5th century BCE, attest to the ability of either man or wife to divorce one's partner simply on one's own volition and simply by a declaration in a public assembly. But not only is this military colony far removed in time and space from 1st century Palestine, it also seems to have been a syncretistic, perhaps polytheistic group of diaspora Jews with their own temple. In addition, the key biblical requirement for divorce, an element emphasized by Jesus as well, namely the certificate of divorce, seems not to have been used by Jews at Elephantine. Thus, equating 1st century Elephantine in Egypt with 1st century Palestine is highly questionable. Certainly, even in 1st century Palestine, the rules were different for the rich and the powerful. One need not be surprised that the Herodian princesses played by their own rules, as do European princesses and Hollywood starlets today. For example, Herodias did indeed divorce her first husband to marry Herod Antipas, but not only was she a member of a highly Hellenized royal family, she may well have initiated the dissolution of her marriage while still dwelling in Rome, where her first husband lived and where her action in the eyes of the Romans would have been perfectly legitimate. Not so in the eyes of pious Palestinian Jews, as the Jewish historian duly notes, wagging his finger, although he's really the last person to wag a moral finger at anybody. Other supposed examples of Jewish women divorcing their husbands either date from a later time, lie outside Jewish Palestine proper, or rest upon very fragmentary and disputed data. All in all, I would maintain, against recent objections, that in the 1st century CE, the ordinary Palestinian woman, neither rich nor powerful, nor of independent means, nor of royal status, could not divorce her husband. The legal world inculcated by the Jewish scriptures, the intertestamental literature, and later by the rabbis seems to have been the reality on the ground for the peasant women of Palestine. It was that Jewish Palestinian reality that the most primitive form of the divorce saying addresses, the power lying with the male. But does the most primitive form available to us, or something like it, actually go back to the historical Jesus? Here, inevitably, we must apply the criteria of historicity or authenticity to the data we have analyzed. Today, as always, the various criteria usually employed in the quest for the historical Jesus are under attack from a number of critics for a number of different reasons. Let me simply say by way of preface that I readily acknowledge that the criteria are rough instruments giving us rough results. They yield various degrees of probability. People looking for golden certitudes are hereby directed to other academic fields. As a matter of fact, a good deal of generally held conclusions about the ancient world, secular and religious, enjoys only varying degrees of probability. I often find it amusing when reading books on ancient or medieval history in the secular sphere to see how often authors will in fact use the equivalent of the criteria of historicity to establish their positions without openly acknowledging what they are doing. It is much better, I think, to be critically aware of how we arrive at our conclusions with a sober sense of the fallibility thereof, a fallibility common to most statements about ancient history. That said, one should also note that the degree of probability one can claim for a position often rises when one's conclusions is supported not just by one, but by a number of the criteria. This seems to be the case with Jesus' prohibition of divorce. Let us look at the first criterion that applies, the criterion of multiple attestation of sources and forms. As we have seen at length, we have multiple attestation of Jesus' prohibition of divorce in three independent sources, Paul, Q, and Mark, all from the first or the very beginning of the second Christian generation. In addition, the multiple attestation occurs in various literary forms: moral exhortation in letters, extended gospel discourses, and a dispute story. Relatively few sayings of Jesus enjoy such broad attestation. This brings us to the second and third criteria, discontinuity and embarrassment. These two criteria often overlap or blend into each other, and that seems to be the case here. On the one hand, discontinuity applies more to Jesus' Jewish background and contemporary milieu. As we have seen at length, in the Old Testament, divorce is taken for granted, and the few laws dealing with divorce generally hem in the otherwise unlimited power of the husband to divorce his wife. This unlimited power is reaffirmed by Philo and Josephus, with debates about the proper grounds for divorce appearing only later on in the Mishnah. With the Damascus document and the Temple Scroll, there is indeed a much more negative view of divorce, yet even these stringent sectarian documents apparently presuppose the reality of divorce within the Essene community. Put simply, the sweeping claim that Qumran or the Essenes forbade all divorce cannot be demonstrated from the evidence at hand. Hence, with his clear and total prohibition of divorce and remarriage, mitigated by no exceptions and no distinctions about grounds, Jesus stands alone in the Judaism of his day, and certainly alone in mainstream Judaism before and after him. This startling singularity, I think, and here I'm getting into murky waters, this startling singularity cannot be dismissed by objections from scholars like E.P. Sanders that, after all, the Old Testament never commands divorce, and that therefore Jesus, like the Essenes or the Pharisees, is simply going beyond the law without rescinding it, a common view today. Well, this does not get around the fact that Jesus is prohibiting an important, pivotal social institution that the law accepts and regulates. By forbidding divorce, Jesus is abrogating not only this institution, but also the laws governing it in the Torah. Indeed, to press the point even further, to a point that often is not considered, by his prohibition, Jesus is stating that a pious, observant Jewish male who carefully fulfills all the requirements of the law in divorcing his first wife to marry a second is ipso facto breaking one of the commandments of the Decalogue: thou shalt not commit adultery. He who divorces and remarries commits adultery. By obeying Deuteronomy 24, 1-4 to the letter, you're breaking the Decalogue. Stop and think what that means to an observant Jew. Thus, Jesus' prohibition is more than simply going beyond the Torah or inculcating a not only but this also radicalism a la E.P. Sanders. The claim that using the institution of divorce, according to all the stipulations of the Torah, is in effect breaking a commandment of the Decalogue, places Jesus in a singular position vis-a-vis mainstream Judaism of any time or any place. On the other hand, the criterion of embarrassment highlights the unlikelihood that the prohibition of divorce is a creation of the early church, a creation that was later attributed to Jesus. From the very start, and for the whole history of the church ever afterward, when it comes to divorce, we find people questioning not for the historical Jesus, but for wiggle room. Paul is prophetic of what is to come. Alone among his various directives in 1 Corinthians 7, in the case of divorce, he feels the need to appeal over the head of his own apostolic authority to Jesus, and he immediately proceeds to create the first Christian wiggle room in the case of mixed marriages. The grand example of wiggle room in the second Christian generation is Matthew's acceptive clause, whatever precisely the exception is. The criterion of embarrassment argues cogently that the early church would not have gone out of its way to create a stringent rule that from the start it found so difficult to observe, like hitting your head against a stone wall because it feels so good when you stop. No doubt many a harried pastor from Paul onwards has secretly wished that Jesus had been more stringent about Sabbath observance and less stringent about divorce. If only he'd done it the other way. The upshot of this negative alliance of discontinuity and embarrassment is that neither mainstream Judaism nor the early church created a total prohibition that is so alien to the ancient and modern mind, Jewish and Gentile alike. Thus, the criteria of multiple attestation, discontinuity, and embarrassment provide the major arguments for tracing the prohibition of divorce back to Jesus. Once these arguments are weighed, it is appropriate to add the seconding voice of the criterion of coherence. In other words, the prohibition of divorce fits the overall contours of the message and ministry of the historical Jesus as best we can reconstruct it. For instance, most questors describe Jesus' approach to the law and human conduct, whether we call this halakha, morality, or ethics, as radical, much more popular in the 60s than today. Most would agree that in the light of the kingdom of God, both imminent yet somehow present in Jesus' ministry, Jesus called his disciples to a radical doing of God's will that was complete and costly. Whether we think of specific commands aimed at certain individuals, follow me and let the dead bury their dead, sell all you have, give to the poor, and then come follow me, or whether we think of general commands issued to all of his followers, love your enemies. There is in Jesus' directives to his followers a bold challenge to be heroic, to go beyond what most moral people would think is required of them to be good. Although hardly emphasized by most questors today, this radicalism seems to have extended to Jesus' rather stringent views on sexuality. William Loader, a great New Zealand-Australian writer, has done some marvelous work on this topic, not too recognized, I think, because he's saying some things that would not be very popular today. Indeed, in this regard, I am reminded of an intriguing argument from Coherence, suggested by the wife of a university professor who had invited me to lecture at the University of California, San Diego. After a discussion during the question period, and it always comes up in the question period, whether Jesus was married or not, the professor's wife suggested that the best argument for Jesus' celibacy was that he totally forbade divorce, something no married man would ever do. And if you think that's just a joke, correlate the positions of the Roman Catholic Church, the Greek Orthodox Church, most Protestant churches on divorce, with the married status of their clergy. There is an intriguing homology there. Moreover, even the act of rescinding certain institutions and regulations in the written Mosaic law is not unheard of in Jesus' teaching. In my opinion, multiple attestation, discontinuity, and embarrassment also argue that the total prohibition of taking an oath goes back to Jesus. Me omosai holos, do not swear at all, neither by heaven, nor by earth, by anything. Yes, yes, no, no, that's it. No swearing, no taking of an oath, whatever. But we should note that in some cases, the Mosaic law does command a person to take an oath in certain situations. Apparently, Jesus' radical ethic at times dared to break with the Mosaic law in specific instances. But at the same time, of course, he presumes and inculcates the Mosaic law in general. How do you explain this? Perhaps because of Jesus' overall sense that in the end time, God would restore not only Israel, but also the whole and wholesome creation he had willed at the beginning, when there was no divorce and no need to swear oaths. In other words, Urzeit und Endzeit. As it was in the beginning, so it shall be in the end, only better. In sum, then, I think the criteria of multiple attestation of sources and forms, discontinuity, embarrassment, and coherence unite to argue a weighty case in favor of the prohibition of divorce going back to Jesus. After this extensive argument, at least, the burden of proof definitely lies on the side of those who would deny authenticity. Well, now that the historicity of the basic prohibition of divorce has been established, we can make the strategic move of returning to the whole dispute story of Mark 10, 2-12. While the core prohibition contained in verse 11 can now be affirmed as historical for the reasons I've just given, the rest of the dispute story is often dismissed as a secondary Christian creation. There are serious reasons for holding this view, including the signs of heavy Markan redaction that pervade the substance and style of the pericope. Other critics would add that the scriptural quotations of Jesus in dispute stories are usually secondary additions to the tradition, though I think this is a more questionable argument. That a public and provocative Jewish religious figure who presented himself as the prophet and teacher of Israel in the last days would never have cited scripture in his arguments strains credulity. Still, the molding hand of Mark the redactor is clear throughout the pericope. For example, the initial question of the Pharisees in verse 2, is it legal for a man to divorce his wife? This question receives a full answer with the same vocabulary, not in Jesus' initial public response to the Pharisees who asked it. Rather, to them he says, out of the blue, what God has yoked together, a human being must not separate. Rather, it's later on in the private response to his disciples in verse 11 that really the initial question is answered in the same sort of language. Perfect inclusio, if indeed Mark is molding the whole story. Nevertheless, there are some indications that behind the present Markan composition may lie an argument that goes back to Jesus. As I've just noted, it would be remarkable if the historical Jesus never argued from Scripture. And as a matter of fact, Jesus' argument against divorce, created by welding together Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, is echoed to a degree in the Damascus document. Not unlike Mark 10, 6-8, the Damascus document argues against certain types of marriage by stringing together two citations from Genesis, the first being the same one Jesus cites in Mark 10:6, male and female he created them. Hence, this particular argument is perfectly at home among Palestinian Jews and need not be attributed to the scribal activity of a Hellenistic Christian church. Then, too, the Mishnah remembers that one of the characteristics of the Pharisees was their concern about divorce and the certificate of divorce in particular. Thus, that the question is put to Jesus precisely by the Pharisees may not be simply a matter of Mark's use of stock figures in his dispute story. To be sure, the climactic aphorism of Jesus in Mark 10:9, what God has yoked together, a human being must not separate, lacks independent multiple attestation. Still, various considerations might incline one to accept its origin in Jesus' own teaching. On the one hand, as far as style is concerned, the saying is a striking subversive aphorism formulated in concise antithetical parallelism, a type of speech characteristic of Jesus. And on the other hand, as far as substance is concerned, there is an intriguing aspect of the New Testament teaching on divorce that is often overlooked, that argues for the saying coming from Jesus. Outside of citing Jesus' own teaching, Christian authors in the New Testament are strangely silent on the problem of divorce. When one considers the broad range of topics that New Testament moral exhortation treats, think of the Haustafel, often repeatedly going over the same issues, The New Testament's almost total silence on the topic of divorce outside of the explicit appeal to Jesus' prohibition is curious. Apparently, either one treated the difficult subject of divorce by appealing to Jesus' teaching, however glossed, or one did not treat the subject at all. In other words, there seems to be no great rush among New Testament authors to mint their own pronouncements about divorce. To put this point another way, once the historicity of the basic prohibition as seen in Paul Q and Mark 10:11 has been accepted, one can extend the argument from coherence to include the differently phrased prohibition of Mark 10:9. After all, it makes sense that once Jesus' prohibition of divorce became known among his fellow Jews, experts on the law would argue with him at length about his teaching. It was a teaching that didn't affect some sectarian group alone, it affected everybody. It also makes sense that during these arguments, Jesus would have formulated his teaching in various ways at various times. Mark 10:9 preserves a formulation that focuses upon the act of divorcing itself and forbids it with an apodictic command. By contrast, the multiply attested saying in Q and Mark combines divorce with remarriage and in a more casuistic formulation forbids the combined action by branding it adultery. Neither formulation, Mark 10:9 or Mark 10:11, need be seen as canceling out or contradicting the other. Rather, the two formulations prohibit the same social reality from two different points of view. In the end, then, I would be inclined to accept the apodictic command in Mark 10:9 as likewise coming from Jesus, though I admit it does not enjoy the same weighty arguments as does the multiply attested saying. Now, you may have noticed by this time that despite all my reconstructions of the tradition history of Jesus' prohibition, I have not taken a stand on which formulation is the one Jesus himself spoke. Actually, I don't think you can make or should make such a choice. Granted, an itinerant Jesus who spent over 2 years preaching to various groups, it may well be that more than one synoptic formulation, however pared down, may go back to him. For example, though I incline to the view that the formulation in Matthew 5:32, the husband causes his wife to be involved in adultery, reflects Matthew's redaction, I cannot entirely exclude the possibility that this wording, as well as that of the primitive Q saying, goes back to Jesus himself. As is usually the case with the historical Jesus, we may feel fairly sure about the substance of his teaching. The exact wording is a much more dicey matter. Our conclusion that the historical Jesus totally forbade divorce admittedly leaves us with a larger problem about Jesus and the Jewish law. To be sure, the Jewish law was a complex and fluid reality around the time of Jesus. Competing texts and competing interpretations abounded. Yet, apart from the extreme allegorists mentioned by Philo in the diaspora and the radical Hellenist reformers who precipitated the Maccabean revolt in the first part of the 2nd century BCE, no prominent Jewish teacher, certainly not in first century Palestine, ever proposed a total or partial abrogation of the written Mosaic law, and certainly neither does Jesus the Jew. Yet we have found a historical Jesus who does apparently abolish the institution of divorce, and I would add the institution of swearing, along with the various laws in the Torah that regulate these institutions. Now, am I in effect sneaking in by the back door the old and largely discredited Christian view that Jesus in his teaching abrogated the law? Certainly not, Paul's me genoitor. But how these individual abrogations fit into Jesus' overall approach to an affirmation of the law is a riddle that I am still struggling with even as I continue to write Volume 4 on Jesus and the law. In particular, does Jesus' approach to divorce set a pattern that holds true in his other teachings on the law? There is no way to know that except to continue with our probes. And so next time we will explore Jesus' approach to the Sabbath and then finally his approach to purity. In other words, stay tuned. Thanks very much.